Michael Kennedy met Annie Johnson on a Tuesday that smelled like rain and cheap coffee. University had barely begun, the campus still buzzing with unfamiliar faces and anxious energy, and they were both lost in the same hallway, clutching course outlines they didn't understand. Annie laughed first when they realized they were circling the same notice board for the third time. Michael smiled back, offered help, and in that small exchange, something settled quietly into place. Their friendship formed easily, like it had been waiting. They studied together, complained about lecturers together, and shared dreams in low voices during late-night reading sessions. Annie was expressive, full of stories and laughter, always gesturing with her hands as she spoke. Michael was quieter, more observant, the kind of person who listened fully before speaking. He noticed everything about her, the way she bit her pen when thinking, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about design, how she carried both confidence and vulnerability at once. It didn't take long for Michael to fall in love with her. He never announced it, never wrote it down, never even admitted it to himself at first. It lived in the background of his life, growing stronger with each shared moment. He loved her ambition, her kindness, the way she refused to dim herself. But more than anything, he loved the way she trusted him completely. Annie dated, she always had. Men came and went, some charming, some careless, most temporary. She gave her heart easily, believing each time that things would be different. They never were. Michael watched from the sidelines, his feelings carefully hidden behind jokes and concern. When things fell apart, Annie always came back to him, eyes red, voice shaky, heart bruised. Michael listened. He offered comfort without judgment, advice without bitterness, and presence without expectation. He never crossed the line. He never told her how it hurt to hear about men who didn't see her worth, how it twisted something inside him every time she cried over someone who didn't choose her. He told himself that being her best friend was enough. Losing her entirely would have been unbearable. After university, life carried them forward together. When Annie decided to study interior design abroad, Michael applied to graduate programs in the same country without hesitation. They packed their lives into suitcases and left Nigeria side by side, chasing bigger dreams. Abroad, they grew into themselves. Annie's talent flourished, her designs bold and thoughtful, full of warmth. Michael discovered his gift for leadership, his mind sharp and strategic. Success followed them quietly, steadily. They built routines in unfamiliar cities, cooked meals together, celebrated milestones, and weathered disappointments. To outsiders, they looked like a couple who simply refused to define themselves. To Michael, it was a balancing act, loving her deeply while pretending he didn't. Annie continued dating, though the pattern never changed. Men admired her beauty, her creativity, her independence, but few stayed long enough to truly know her. Some cheated, others took her for granted. Each heartbreak chipped away at her confidence, even as she tried to hide it. Michael was always there, arms open, voice calm, reminding her of who she was when the world made her forget. Sometimes, late at night, when Annie fell asleep on the couch after crying herself empty, Michael allowed himself to feel everything he usually pushed down. He imagined what it would be like to be the man she chose, the one she leaned into instead of collapsing beside. But morning always came, and with it, his resolve to stay silent. Years later, they returned to Nigeria together, older and more accomplished, carrying degrees and experiences that set them apart. Annie quickly became known for her impeccable taste, her ability to transform spaces into reflections of the people who lived in them. Michael climbed the ranks of the tech industry, his company rising fast, his reputation solid. From the outside, they looked like two successful adults navigating life with ease. But inside, nothing had changed. They still spoke every day. They still shared meals, laughter, secrets. Annie still dated, still got hurt. Michael still stayed. Friends often asked why he had never settled down, why someone like him was always alone. He brushed it off with humor, saying he was focused on work. The truth was simpler and heavier. His heart had never been available. Annie never questioned it. To her, Michael was constant, unshakable, the one person who never left. She assumed he would always be there just as he always had been, She didn't see the restraint it took, the love he carried quietly, the years he gave without asking for more. On the day they unpacked the last box in their separate apartments back home, Annie hugged him tightly, smiling as she talked about everything ahead. Michael hugged her back, holding on just a second longer than necessary. They stood at the edge of something undefined, successful, inseparable, and emotionally misaligned. Michael watched her walk away, the familiar ache settling into his chest. He told himself, as he always did, that this was enough, that loving her from a distance was better than not loving her at all. And so he stayed. By the time they turned 30, life had done exactly what everyone promised it would. It separated dreams from reality and rewarded the ones who refused to quit. Annie Johnson was one of those people. Her interior design firm had grown from a one-woman hustle into a respected brand. Her work was everywhere. Luxury apartments in Lekki, boutique hotels in Victoria Island, private homes on Banana Island. Clients trusted her instinct, her eye for balance, her ability to make a space feel like truth instead of decoration. She worked long hours, traveled often, and loved fiercely. On paper, Annie's life looked full. Emotionally, it was a different story. Michael Kennedy watched her succeed from a careful distance. As CEO of one of Nigeria's fastest-rising tech companies, his life was structured, demanding, and relentlessly public. Board meetings, investor calls, interviews, late nights. He was respected, admired, and quietly envied. People often spoke about him as if he were already a legend in motion. What they didn't talk about was how alone he was. Michael's days were filled with people, but his nights were silent. No one waited for him at home. No one asked how his day went. No one shared his bed or his future plans. And every time someone tried to set him up, every time a colleague hinted at interest, his mind went back to Annie. Always Annie. She dated again and again and again. There was Daniel, the charming consultant who talked a good game and disappeared the moment things became serious. There was Femi, who promised stability but cheated without remorse. There was Luke, who loved being seen with her but never truly saw her. Each time Annie convinced herself she was learning. Each time she ended up hurt. And each time she called Michael. Sometimes it was midnight. Sometimes it was early morning. Sometimes she just showed up at his place with swollen eyes and a forced smile that never fooled him. Michael never complained. He never told her he was busy. He never told her it hurt. He listened. He sat beside her on the couch, handed her tissues, made tea she barely touched. He let her cry into his chest, let her talk in circles, let her rage and doubt and blame herself. He told her she deserved better. He told her she was enough. He told her the men who treated her badly were blind. He never told her that he was standing right there. After she left, after the silence returned, Michael allowed himself to feel the weight of it, the jealousy he swallowed, the anger he redirected inward, the loneliness that followed him into sleep. He told himself that this was the price of loving someone selflessly, that if being her safe place meant never being her choice, then so be it. But some nights the truth pressed harder. There were moments, small, dangerous moments, when Annie would laugh a little too freely, lean into him a little too comfortably, or say things like, "I don't know what I'd do without you." Those moments filled Michael with equal parts warmth and despair, because he knew she meant it platonically, because he knew she didn't see what was standing in front of her. Friends noticed. They always did. "Michael, why are you still single?" someone asked him at a networking dinner once. "You could have anyone," another added casually. He smiled, gave vague answers about timing and priorities. He never said her name. Annie never questioned it. To her, Michael was simply Michael, constant, dependable, emotionally available in a way she assumed was natural. She told him about her dates in detail, sometimes too much detail, unaware of how carefully he controlled his reactions. There was one night, after yet another breakup, when she curled up beside him and said quietly, "Why do men always leave?" Michael looked at her, at the woman he had loved for over a decade, and fought the urge to say, "I never did." Instead, he said, "Because they're not ready for what you offer." She nodded, believing him. Believing everything except the truth. Michael's company grew rapidly that year. Expansion plans, new hires, bigger offices. His calendar filled up, but his heart stayed exactly where it had always been. At work, he was decisive and confident. At home, he was careful and restrained. He learned to live in that contrast. Then came the email. End-of-year corporate gala, attendance mandatory, +1 required. Michael stared at the screen longer than necessary. Every year, he had been the odd one out. The successful CEO who arrived alone, left alone. People whispered, speculated, joked. He never cared, until now. Something about this year felt heavier, lonelier, like a mirror being held up to everything he had avoided. He thought of Annie instantly. The idea settled into him slowly, dangerously. He told himself it was harmless. Just one night, just pretending, just convenience. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just that. When he asked Annie, she laughed. "You? With a +1?" she teased. "Who are you trying to impress?" "You," he said without thinking, then quickly added, "I mean, my colleagues." She studied him for a moment, amused. "So you want me to be your fake girlfriend?" "Just for the night," he said carefully. "I'm tired of being the odd one out." She shrugged. "Why not? It'll be fun." Michael smiled, but inside, something tightened. Because for him, it wouldn't be pretend at all. As the date approached, Michael felt something he hadn't felt in years. Anticipation mixed with fear. For once, he would get to stand beside her openly. For once, he would get to claim her, even if only in name. For once, the line he had never crossed would blur. He told himself not to expect anything more. But hope has a way of sneaking in where it doesn't belong. And as the night of the party drew closer, Michael Kennedy prepared himself for a room full of people, a woman he already loved, and a moment that would quietly change everything. He just didn't know how much yet. Annie treated the invitation like a joke at first. "Michael Kennedy, CEO of the most talked-about tech company in Lagos," she said over the phone, laughter dancing in her voice. "You're telling me you need me to help you look less single?" Michael smiled, standing in his living room with his phone pressed to his ear, staring at nothing. "I'm serious, just for the night." She teased him for a few minutes more, calling him dramatic, asking if this was some elaborate attempt to finally enter the dating scene. To Annie, it was light, harmless, even funny. To Michael, it felt like standing on the edge of something he had avoided his entire life. Eventually, she agreed. "Fine," she said, "I'll be your fake girlfriend. But you owe me food and ice cream." "Deal," Michael replied, relief and nerves colliding in his chest. The day of the party arrived faster than he expected. Michael dressed carefully, more deliberately than usual. The tailored suit fit him perfectly, charcoal gray with a crisp white shirt underneath. He adjusted his cufflinks twice, checked his reflection, then looked away. None of it mattered, not really. The only thing that did was Annie. When he pulled up in front of her building, he told himself to breathe. He stepped out of the car just as she came through the glass doors. And then he forgot how. Annie stood there, framed by the fading daylight, and the world seemed to pause around her. Her dress hugged her in all the right places, elegant, understated, impossibly beautiful. Her caramel skin glowed, catching the light like it had been kissed by gold. Her hair fell softly around her shoulders, and for a moment, Michael could only stare. She noticed. "Hey," she said, waving a hand in front of his face. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Michael swallowed. You're so beautiful." Annie blinked, slightly taken aback. "Thank you?" He cleared his throat quickly. "My colleagues are going to be very surprised I could bag someone like you." She laughed, shaking her head. "You're ridiculous." But as she stepped closer, slipping into the car beside him, something shifted between them. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there, an awareness that hadn't existed before. At the venue, the shift became impossible to ignore. The moment they walked in together, heads turned, conversations paused. Annie felt eyes on her from every direction, curiosity and admiration following her steps. Michael placed a hand at the small of her back instinctively, guiding her forward. The gesture was natural, protective, and Annie felt it immediately. Colleagues approached, smiles wide, surprise barely concealed. "So this is the famous girlfriend," someone said warmly. Michael didn't hesitate. "This is Annie." The way he said her name, steady, proud, made her heart flutter in a way she wasn't prepared for. The night unfolded like a dream Annie hadn't known she was craving. Michael stayed close, always aware of her presence. He introduced her with intention, his hand never straying far. He listened to her, laughed with her, watched her like she was the only person in the room. And then there was Lillian. She appeared with practiced confidence, her smile sharp, her eyes assessing Annie openly. "So," she said, turning to Michael, "this is your girlfriend?" "Yes," Michael replied calmly, his arm tightening slightly around Annie's waist. "She is." Lillian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Interesting. I didn't know you were seeing anyone." Michael met her gaze, unbothered. "Now you do." Annie glanced up at him later, once Lillian had walked away. "You didn't have to shut her down like that." "I know," he said quietly, "but I wanted to." She studied his face, the seriousness there, and something warm settled in her chest. The rest of the night felt different from anything Annie had experienced before. Michael was attentive in ways no one had ever been with her. He checked in constantly, asking if she was comfortable, if she needed anything, if she wanted to leave. When someone spoke over her, he gently redirected the conversation back to her. When she laughed, he looked like he was memorizing the sound. Annie felt cherished. It was a strange realization, heavy and light all at once. This care, this presence, was what she had always wanted, and it was coming from the one person she had never thought to look at that way. At one point, they found themselves standing a little apart from the crowd, music humming softly around them. Michael looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "For the first time in my life," he said quietly, "I get to walk into a room and say you're mine." Annie's breath caught. "Michael, I know it's pretend," he continued, his voice low, "but for tonight, I'm not taking you for granted." She didn't know what to say. The words settled into her, stirring something she had no name for. When the night finally ended, Michael drove her home, stopping to buy ice cream just like he promised. They laughed in the car, the tension easing but never disappearing completely. At her door, he hugged her a little longer than usual. "Thank you," he said softly, "for tonight." She smiled. "Anytime." But when she went inside, Annie leaned against the door, heart racing, replaying the night over and over. The way he looked at her, the way he protected her, the way it felt to be chosen, even if just for a night. Michael drove home in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had tasted something he had wanted for years, and letting go would not be easy. Because pretend or not, something real had begun, and neither of them could ignore it anymore. The shift didn't announce itself loudly. It arrived quietly, slipping into Annie's days the way truth often did, uninvited, persistent, impossible to ignore. Michael started calling more. Not just the usual check-ins or casual jokes, but real questions. What had she eaten? Was she tired? Did she get home safely? He remembered things she mentioned in passing and followed up on them days later. He sent her articles he thought she'd like, restaurants he wanted her to try, designs he wanted her opinion on. At first, Annie brushed it off as nothing. But slowly it became something. She noticed how he paused his meetings to answer her calls, how he showed up unannounced with food when she mentioned she'd had a long day, how his eyes lingered on her now, no longer hidden behind easy familiarity. He wasn't crossing any lines, but he was standing closer to them than ever before. And it unsettled her. Because with every thoughtful gesture, Annie felt a quiet discomfort growing inside her. Not fear exactly, more like awareness, a nagging sense that she had been missing something important for a very long time. At night, she replayed memories she had never thought to question. Michael picking her up after breakups. Michael sitting silently beside her when words failed. Michael never dating. Michael always staying. The realization crept in slowly, frightening in its clarity. Michael had never left, and she had never noticed what that truly meant. One evening, after canceling yet another disappointing date, Annie sat alone in her living room, popcorn untouched in the bowl she had made out of habit. Her phone lay face up on the table, Michael's name glowing on the screen from a missed call earlier. She didn't call him back immediately. Instead, she sat with the truth pressing against her chest, heavy and undeniable. The party, the way he held her, the way it felt to be protected, the way no one else had ever made her feel that safe. Annie inhaled deeply and made a decision she couldn't undo. She texted him, "Can you come over? I think we need to talk." Michael read the message twice. He had been in the middle of reviewing documents, but the moment he saw her words, everything else faded in the background. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with a strange sense of inevitability. He arrived at her place 30 minutes later. Annie opened the door and smiled nervously. She had changed into something comfortable, her hair loose, her face bare. There was no performance tonight, no pretending. They sat across from each other, the space between them heavier than it had ever been. She offered him popcorn. He declined. The silence stretched. "Michael," Annie finally said, voice unsteady, "there's something I need to ask you." He nodded slowly, already knowing. She took a breath. Have you always been in love with me?" The question hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. Michael didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, really looked at her, and in that moment, he understood that there was no running left, no hiding, no pretending this was anything other than what it had always been. "Yes," he said quietly. Annie's heart skipped. "Since when?" "Since university," he replied. "Since before we even knew what love was supposed to feel like." Her breath caught. "Why didn't you tell me?" Michael exhaled slowly, years of restraint loosening all at once. "Because I was afraid of losing you, afraid that if I crossed that line, I wouldn't even have you as my friend anymore." He stood, pacing now, the words spilling out. "I watched you give yourself to men who didn't deserve you. I watched you cry over people who didn't choose you. And every time I told myself it wasn't my place to say anything." Annie felt tears rise, uninvited. "I loved you quietly," he continued. "I loved you when you didn't see me. I loved you when you needed someone else. I loved you even when it hurt." His voice broke slightly. "Do you know how painful it is to be the one you run to after someone else breaks you?" The room felt too small. "I never dated," he said. "Not because I didn't have options, but because my heart wasn't available. It belonged to you." Annie shook her head slowly, overwhelmed. "Michael, this is too much." "I know," he said softly. "I'm not asking you to love me back. I just needed you to know the truth." She stood abruptly, panic rising. "No, this changes everything. I never thought of you like that." "I know," he said, "and I was okay with that. I chose that." She turned away, hands trembling. "I don't want to ruin what we have." Michael's voice was quiet but firm. "What we have already changed." The truth landed between them like a breaking wave. "I can't do this," Annie whispered. "I need you as my friend. I can't lose that." Michael nodded slowly, pain etched into his expression. "I understand." But understanding didn't soften the hurt. He grabbed his jacket, pausing at the door. "I meant it when I said I'm not taking you for granted, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel anything." Annie's tears spilled freely now. "I'm sorry." "So am I," he said. The door closed behind him with a quiet finality. That night, Annie lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying his words over and over. Love she hadn't asked for, truth she hadn't been ready to face, fear that had chosen for her. Michael drove home in silence, his chest hollow. For the first time in his life, staying hurt more than leaving. And for the first time, the distance between them felt real. Time did what it always did best. It moved forward without asking permission. At first, Annie Johnson tried to move with it. She threw herself back into work, took on new projects, redesigned spaces until her hands ached and her mind was too tired to think. She told herself she had made the right choice. Michael was her best friend. Crossing that line had felt terrifying. Losing him completely would have been unbearable. But distance had a way of clarifying things she had spent years ignoring. Michael stopped calling the way he used to. He still checked in occasionally, still cared, but there was a carefulness to him now, a boundary he hadn't needed before. Annie felt it every time she reached for her phone and hesitated, every time she wanted to share something small and realized she no longer knew if she was allowed to. She tried dating again. There was a man who seemed promising at first, attentive, charming, eager. But when Annie talked about her dreams, he changed the subject. When she needed reassurance, he grew distant. Another man made grand gestures but disappeared when things became inconvenient. One cheated, another took her presence for granted. Each time, the pattern repeated itself. And each time, Annie found herself thinking of Michael. She thought of how he had listened without interruption, how he had shown up without being asked, how he had never made her feel like too much or not enough. Slowly, painfully, the truth settled into her bones. Michael had never been the safe option. He had been the real one. The realization didn't come with fireworks or sudden clarity. It came quietly, one lonely evening at a time. It came when she caught herself comparing every man to him and finding them all lacking. It came when she remembered his confession, not as pressure, but as honesty. Love offered without demand. She had been afraid of ruining something good, afraid of choosing wrong again, afraid of trusting love that felt too steady, too patient, too close to home. By the time Annie admitted the truth to herself, she knew there was no avoiding it. She loved him, not as a best friend, not as familiarity, but as the man who had always been there, waiting without resentment. The question was whether she had waited too long. Michael had changed too. He threw himself deeper into his work, not as an escape, but as structure. He learned how to live without being Annie's emotional anchor. It hurt, but it also forced him to reclaim parts of himself he had neglected for years. He dated, briefly, cautiously, but nothing stuck. His heart, even bruised, knew where it belonged. When Annie called him one evening, months after that night, his first instinct was to hesitate. "Michael," she said softly, "can we talk?" Something in her voice was different, not panicked, not defensive, honest. They met at a quiet cafe, neutral ground. Annie arrived early, hands clasped together, nerves fluttering. When Michael walked in, she felt it immediately. The familiarity, the comfort, the ache. They talked slowly at first, about work, about life, about everything and nothing. And then Annie took a breath and said the words she had been holding back for months. "I was wrong." Michael didn't interrupt. "I was afraid," she continued, "afraid of losing you, afraid of risking something that mattered. But I lost you anyway, didn't I?" He looked at her, guarded but present. "You didn't lose me. I just stepped back." She nodded. "You were never just my safe place. You were the love I didn't know how to choose." Silence followed, heavy but not hostile. "I don't expect you to trust me immediately," Annie said, "but I need you to know that I'm choosing you now, fully, honestly." Michael exhaled slowly. "I won't lie. You hurt me." "I know," she whispered, "and I'll spend as long as it takes making it right." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "We start slowly." That was enough. Their relationship didn't explode into passion overnight. It grew carefully, intentionally. They learned each other again, not as friends pretending there was nothing more, but as two people choosing love with open eyes. There were awkward moments, vulnerable conversations, laughter mixed with healing. And when Michael finally kissed her, not as a possibility, but as a promise, it felt like coming home. Marriage followed not out of urgency, but certainty. Their wedding was simple, warm, full of people who had always suspected this ending. Annie stood beside Michael, looking at him with gratitude instead of doubt. Michael looked back at her with peace instead of restraint. That night, when the door finally closed behind them, the world felt hushed, like it was giving them permission. Michael touched Annie slowly, reverently, as though he had waited his whole life to earn the right. There was no rush, only trembling hands and shared breaths. Years of restraint melting into something tender and sure. Annie felt seen in a way she never had before, not as a body to be wanted briefly, but as a woman to be cherished completely. When he kissed her, it was deep and intentional, carrying everything he had never said out loud. She responded with equal hunger, equal certainty, pulling him closer as if afraid the moment might disappear. Every touch felt meaningful, layered with trust, history, and quiet devotion. Michael moved with care, constantly checking her eyes, her reactions, making sure she felt safe, wanted, chosen. Annie realized then that love could be powerful without being rough, intense without being careless. The connection between them was overwhelming, emotional as much as physical. She whispered his name like a confession, like an apology, like gratitude all at once. Michael held her as though she was something precious, something he never wanted to break. Time seemed to slow, stretching the night into something unforgettable. When it was over, they stayed wrapped around each other, hearts racing, breaths sinking. Annie rested her head on his chest and understood, with a quiet ache, that this was the love she had been searching for all along. Love did not arrive loudly from Michael and Annie. It settled. It moved into their days with the ease of something that had always belonged there, filling spaces that had once felt hollow. Marriage didn't change the foundation they had built. It strengthened it. Their friendship remained the quiet spine of everything, now layered with intimacy, trust, and the certainty of choice. Their home reflected them both. Annie's touch was everywhere. Soft neutrals, warm lighting, textures that made the rooms feel alive. Michael teased her about turning every corner into a masterpiece, but he loved the way the house felt like a sanctuary. It was the first place he had ever lived that truly felt like rest. Mornings were unhurried when they could be. Coffee brewed while sunlight crept through the windows. Sometimes they worked in silence. Sometimes they talked endlessly. Sometimes they just existed together, comfortable and complete. Michael learned how to be present outside of responsibility, how to put work down without guilt. Annie learned how to receive love without suspicion. There were moments Annie caught herself watching him, standing in the kitchen, reading quietly, smiling to himself, and she would feel that familiar ache of gratitude. She had spent so many years chasing intensity, confusing inconsistency for passion. Michael had never made her chase. He had waited. Pregnancy changed everything again, softly but profoundly. When Annie told him, Michael froze at first, as if the words needed time to find their way into his body. Then his eyes filled, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her with a reverence that left her breathless. He talked to her belly before there was anything to see, whispered promises he never thought he would get to keep. Annie's body changed. Her emotions shifted. Some days were joyful, others overwhelming. Michael was steady through all of it, attentive without hovering, supportive without control. He learned her rhythms, learned when to talk and when to simply sit beside her. He made space for her fears without trying to fix them. Watching him become a father before the child even arrived healed something in Annie she hadn't known was still broken. She thought often about the woman she used to be, the girl who believed love had to hurt to be real, who stayed too long where she wasn't chosen. She didn't judge that version of herself anymore. She understood her now. She had been searching for something she didn't know how to recognize. Michael had known. The night their child was born, Annie watched Michael hold their baby and felt her chest swell with a quiet, overwhelming joy. There was no doubt left in her mind, no lingering fear. This was the life they had built deliberately, patiently together. Their days became fuller, busier, messier, sleepless nights, soft lullabies, shared exhaustion that somehow felt lighter because it was shared. Michael adjusted his schedule without resentment. Annie slowed her work without guilt. They learned a new version of balance, imperfect but intentional. Love showed up in small ways now. In the way Michael always checked the car seat twice. In the way Annie still reached for his hand in crowded rooms. In the way they argued gently and resolved quickly, refusing to let silence become distance. They chose each other every day, not because it was easy, but because it was right. Sometimes when the house was quiet and the world felt far away, Annie would think back to that night years ago. The party, the pretending, the moment everything shifted. She would realize how fragile that turning point had been, how close she had come to missing this life entirely. It humbled her. One evening, as they sat on the balcony, watching the city lights blink awake, Annie rested her head on Michael's shoulder and said softly, "Thank you for staying." Michael kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for choosing." That was the truth of them. Not fate, not timing, choice. Friendship had grown into love. Love had matured into partnership, and partnership had become peace. Michael's reward was never just Annie's love. It was the quiet certainty that he was finally home.